Okay. All right. So here we are. We're going to talk about how to demystify the process of getting regulatory approval. So we've talked about how to sell a medical device. We've talked about how to get it funded. We've talked about innovation and leading in this space. But a device cannot actually be used or sold in a patient until you get regulatory approval. So that's what these three panelists are going to talk to us about. Really, how do we get that to happen, the process behind it, and really debunking some of the mysteries and challenges that you might be hearing about. We're going to give you a pathway to solve that. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we'll jump right into the questions. So we'll start with David.
All right, good afternoon. Thanks everybody for sticking around for the tail end of our program today. Regulatory, we may be the last session, but it's definitely an important piece of the whole puzzle because without it, as Ivy said, you cannot sell your product. You can't make revenue, and that's the end of a company. So I'm David Orr. I am CEO of MedPoint. We're a company based in Greenville, South Carolina. We're a professional service provider and consulting company to medical device, pharmaceutical, and biologics manufacturers. We serve them globally in different ways to support quality, regulatory, and clinical initiatives. My tie to Clemson here is I actually came back to grad school after a career in industrial products, doing early stage engineering development and global manufacturing. Decided to go back to grad school and pursue a degree, a PhD in bioengineering. Finished that up in 2006, but really the impetus for me coming back to grad school was to start a company. I had an entrepreneurial aspiration, wanted to do that, and by no means thought it would happen as fast as it did because coming out of grad school, literally 20 years ago this month in September, it was September 5th, 2005, a colleague and I, Matt Gavart, a good friend of mine and I, started Kiatech. And so we started that out of the university based on my graduate research here in the bioengineering program. And it's still around today in downtown Greenville. It's still got challenges ahead of it. It's still got a road ahead of it, and we're thankful that it's still alive and churning. But just proud to say that I had some connections to that in the early days. I've since gone on to work for other early stage and growth stage organizations in engineering development, manufacturing, and commercial launch. But excited to have worked on all the different products and categories that I have over the years.
My name is Russ King. I'm president of a company called MethodSense. MethodSense is in its 25th year. We do two things. We're regulatory affairs and quality assurance consultants, and unlike David, we focus primarily on the medical device industry or combination products. And in our practice, we work with companies across their entire product life cycle, developing strategies, helping them with pre-submission meetings, building, delivering quality management systems, implementing them, human factor studies, V&V work, cybersecurity work, submissions, defending submissions. And we also make a piece of software that also maps onto the entire product life cycle and helps drive that product life cycle. Our goal as a company is to create more efficient paths to revenue, because it's what we're all about, and that is developing businesses in ways that can benefit people, and they need to be on the market to be able to do that. So that's our goal. My connection with Clemson University is that I hire Clemson students. So we have job openings, and we're here to talk to people about hiring, and hopefully I'll be able to answer some questions about why consulting might be a career path worth considering.
My name is Steve Johnson. I am with South Carolina Research Authority. You've probably heard the acronym SCRA mentioned several times. I am in the academic innovations area, which means I work with Clemson, that other school in Columbia, and MUSC. We work to get technologies out of the lab and into the market, which is what this is all about today. We provide coaching, guidance, grants, and investments. Investments of up to $1 million in 3 tranches to get technology mature, data generated, And my background is I started with Dow Chemical right out of school. I did not go to Clemson, although my daughter and son-in-law and father-in-law and everybody else did. But I went to work for Dow Chemical, um, made a career with Dow in new product development, eventually wound up in life science. I've started 3 life science companies, the last of which started with drawings on a napkin, worked to a working prototype, went to animal trials here at Godley Snell, to human trials in Greenville, and then to Johns Hopkins. The company was acquired, and I went to work for SCRA. And so in that process, I have worked extensively with FDA. My company was elected to be in the Innovation Pathway program with FDA, which was a great experience, and learned a lot from it.
All right, great. So as you can see, we picked the best 3 people in the world to actually sit on our panel tonight. So let's start with some basics. So maybe let's stay in the United States. What are some of the pathways for regulatory approval for a medical device? Where do we start?
Well, there are 3 basic pathways depending upon the risk classification of the product. It can either be a class 1 product, class 2 product, or class 3 product. Class 1 product, that pathway is you fill out a form on the FDA website, build a quality system, and pay the FDA money, and then you're in business. Class 2 product typically requires a 510K, could also include something called a de novo pathway. 510K, the theoretical underpinnings of that is that if your product is substantially equivalent to one currently approved and on the market, and you can demonstrate substantial equivalence, then you can build a 510K submission around that, submit it to the FDA, allow them to consider, review, and agree with you that the substantial equivalence has been established. If there is no predicate to which to establish substantial equivalence, then you can consider a de novo pathway, in which case the FDA will create a product code for you. And you'll argue one of 2 pathways with your de novo. And that would be either that your risk profile satisfies what's expected in a class 2 device. And if you're failing in that, then you're off on a PMA. PMA ensures clinical trials and studies, $20 million, 10 years of your life, and a lot of other hard work.
I think that covered basics of
So
the different
yeah,
pathways.
say that covers basics, but go ahead, Steve.
One thing to remember is the classification from FDA drives everything. It will drive your milestones. Your milestones could be 1 year, 3 year, 5, it could be 10 years. It will also drive when your expenses will hit. From there, it will also drive when you need to raise capital. So I look at pro formas from startup life science companies every week. And I like to see the milestones that they have to hit at the top, how they're classified, what the milestones are. And then I looked at see if the expenses and the capital raises align with those milestones, because that is what truly drives when you need to raise capital and what time.
Can I? Yep. So one of the important things to remember is that your regulatory strategy driving those milestones is going to be critical, but your regulatory strategy isn't necessarily something written in stone in advance. There are various ways that you can navigate easier and harder pathways through the FDA. They can dictate business strategy or contribute to making business decisions. And one of the reasons why you want to choose your regulatory partners well is as they can contribute to information, strategy, and other content to help you make those business decisions. Just by way of an example, we worked on a product and they wanted to have a 510K. We said, hey, no, let's be a wellness product for a while, make some money. So we'll dumb down the indications of use, be a wellness product, and then when we have revenues coming in, then we'll be a medical device. And we did. We then filed the 510(k), moved that through. So there are various ways in which you can approach being a business, and regulatory affairs can contribute to how you structure and think about the pathway for that business.
So to add on what Steve and Russ have both shared, just to give you an example from the real world that I lived through, might call it hell, but there was a situation based on the strategy. When I first joined a company, it was an early stage company. I was employee number 3. This company was based out of Atlanta. Early stage renal failure was our treatment that we were looking at, and that was the indication. The founder thought we would get an easy 510(k), be on the market within a year. I joined the company thinking that was the pathway in front of us. We ended up having 2 face-to-face meetings. We were going to use a ureteral stent as kind of our predicate, but ours was a little different. We had a suction, a vacuum pump tied to our essentially a ureteral stent, a bit longer ureteral stent that extended out of the body, attached to this pump, and we applied a low-grade suction to the nephrons of the kidneys to try and prompt and encourage flow across those nephrons. And trying to encourage healing over time to overcome that early stage renal failure. FDA didn't agree with us that it was going to be a 510(k) pathway. Probably pretty clear if I'd investigated a little bit deeper and understood exactly what the technology was intended to do at the time when I joined the company. So we had 2 face-to-face meetings with FDA, and it was identified that we're going to have to go down that de novo pathway. And one thing about regulatory, it is married at the hip with clinical. And you may not always need clinical evidence, but you have to demonstrate clinical safety and efficacy to ensure or to convince the FDA that this product is worth approving or clearing for use with humans. And so the first time we met with them, we had a clinical trial plan in place. We're going to have to go down that road because it was de novo. We're going to have to spend a whole lot more money on this trial. We thought it'd be a small patient trial, maybe 10 patients, maybe even 5 if we could get away with it. And the bonus was everybody has 2 kidneys, or almost everybody has 2 kidneys. So we thought we've got a good safety factor here because we're only going to treat 1 kidney. We're going to leave the other kidney alone. And that'll kind of actually even serve as our control. So we thought, man, this is a no-brainer. The FDA should approve this trial, the IDE, the investigational device exemption that we were going for at that point, so we could start our trial. No, they didn't agree with us. And we couldn't get agreement across the committee. You're meeting face-to-face with the whole committee. You got doctors, you've got the project managers, you've got the engineers from FDA in the room. You're trying to convince this entire committee that they should say yes to your trial design and allow you to move forward with your IDE. We could not convince them. So a year and a half later, we had another face-to-face meeting. We had tweaked some things with the trial design, tried to make it safer. We thought, what else can we do to make this safer? I was there a year and a half. I ended up having to leave because of funding issues for the company. It was a challenge. And as Steve pointed out, there's those funding milestones where you know where there's going to be inflection points, where there's going to be a lot of money that's needed to keep this thing alive. I ended up leaving after a year and a half. They did not get that trial started for 5.5 years. And ultimately, what it boiled down to, or what ultimately the committee agreed to, was to narrow the patient population that they would target. So we were going to go after anything and everything. So cardiac congestion, sepsis, a whole variety, post-operative surgical congestion, and those types of things. So it was all comers. FDA didn't like that. So we had to narrow that down, and what they ended up getting approval for was post-surgical cardiac congestion, ultimately. It was a very narrow patient population, which really limited the number of patients that they could then recruit at different sites. But it was 5.5 years before they could get their trial going off the ground and get first in human use of their device. They did a safety study of about 9 patients. They are now just commencing their pivotal study that the FDA is now requiring of them, and we're now 9 years later. So that's just an example of what we thought was a very simple, straightforward product and application, and regulatory requirements, along with clinical requirements, have stretched that out into more of what would look like a pharmaceutical pathway and duration. Hopefully the money isn't quite on the level of pharmaceuticals, but that's just a real world story of where regulatory, if you don't know it and you don't pay attention to it and build out an appropriate strategy, it can come and bite you back in the butt. So
I mean, when you think about real life stories, I mean, this is what regulatory gets you. There's some uncertainty, but it's also a significant strategic element to your business. But let's think about this. So I think when you think about regulatory approvals, you think and medical devices, you're thinking about implants, instruments. You know, you think about some of the basic things that are tried and true. We've got a good process in place and a governance in place to solve that. Well, what about all this new digital work? What about robotics? What about software as a medical device? What about software as solutions and some of these other systems? How does that affect regulatory pathways, and what do we need to think about if our company, our startup company, is a software-driven, robotic-assisted surgical device?
I'll stick with AI because my firm has right now at the moment 8 AI products in front of the FDA. We're talking to the FDA on a regular basis. AI it also has another dimension. The FDA is using AI. So it's becoming through and through and very challenging in many respects. From a product perspective, AI has very specific demands. They're looking for very specific things. They're looking for a very competent, complete statistical analysis plan. They want to see that that statistical analysis plan is aligned well with the indications of use and that you're demonstrating that. They're very particular about what trains the algorithm, then what validates the algorithm, where that data comes from. I can't tell you how many companies come to us and says, well, we got 5,000 cardiograms from Ireland. And we have to tell them, well, they're not interested in Irish patients. They're interested in US patients. So we have to figure something out. So there's a lot of things that go into that. From the FDA side of things, there's something new called ELSA. How many people have heard of ELSA? ELSA is an AI program that they use. It basically knows the guidances, knows the regulations, knows histories, and they shove a submission through it. And the ELSA spits back out inconsistencies and problems that it perceives, and it's not doing a super good job at the moment. It will get better. It has a great tendency to prolong the process at the moment and confuses even the reviewers when they see the outcome of this product. So AI, from a digital perspective, software as a medical device, is predominant. And I think that there's been a lot of talk during this today oriented around large strategic companies and opportunities at strategics, Strykers, the Medtronics of the world. I think that if you're thinking about careers in the medical devices, you should also think about the many thousands of emerging companies that are small companies in the digital space. And if you have not had an opportunity to understand software, then I would take advantage of as many opportunities as you can to understand how software works, why it does what it does. When you press execute, how does that happen that things get executed, so that you can understand better from supporting a digital health company, the mechanics of the product.
Always remember the two major objectives and goals of the FDA. Safety is number one. Efficacy is number two. With the whole realm of AI coming in, the issue of safety takes on another dimension we didn't even know existed 10 years ago. What do you mean? The algorithm has to be proven. Just remember, as you are working to put together a plan to take to the FDA, the two main things they're looking for is it safe? And safety can range from what could go wrong to what other things could it interact with to efficacy. Does it do what you say it does? And does it do it in every or most every patient? And do you have data, data, data to validate it? That's important too, because the VCs of the world are pushing their investments later and later. What they want to see along the, and they want you to de-risk that technology before they buy it. And to do that, you must have good data.
One quick comment. The best source of data that we're aware of is the Mayo Clinic. So if you are data dependent and want to find a good partner, go to the Mayo Clinic, and they might be a good partner for you.
So a couple different areas where AI is being applied that I've learned of just recently. One of our large clients, a Fortune 500 medical device manufacturer, was sitting with one of their directors, and he was sharing with me how they applied AI to build out a small language model internally within the company, because they had had some challenges in previous regulatory submissions that they were getting extended reviews, which can extend for as long as FDA really wants to make it extend. You know, they have their initial response window that they have to give you an answer in, but they have their right to extend it if necessary. And these extensions were going on the order of 6 months, 8 months, 9 months before they would get an answer. And sometimes it would end in a, no clearance or no approval. Well, their most recent regulatory submission, what they did was used AI to build out a small language model, trained it on very discrete documentation, all related to the standards, 21 CFR, ISO 1345, and all of the necessary requirements within the application process that FDA puts out. That may be guidance documents, it may be some of their discrete documentation about exactly what has to be in that submission. They did that, and they didn't have AI write the submission for the FDA application or the clearance application, but they had their AI system review it internally before they submitted it. AI made all these corrections, changed a lot of the verbiage, a lot of the language, and a lot of the contextual aspects of the application to align it to all of these different guidance documents and specification standards. They submitted it. They had a 6-week review, came back, done, cleared, product was ready to go, and they could launch. And that was the fastest they had had in years. And so I think simply using AI to align with what FDA wants to see, very simple application, very simple, straightforward need. They did it, and they got a great outcome that's going to result in millions of dollars of potential return because they're getting onto the market that much faster. And so that's just another way that within your job someday you may be incorporating AI, and it's good to be aware of that type of application. And that's more of like an inter-industry application, I would say. But the other side of things is within the product development phases, particularly on the idea of applying machine learning within products in the medical device space. Another company, I was at the Food and Drug Law Institute meeting this year, and one of the large medical device manufacturers shared a case study. And forgive me, I can't remember the exact terminology of what they called it, but within machine learning, obviously the artificial intelligence is growing. It's learning over time. And that could result in changes, particularly in the diagnostic space, you can imagine. What it's grading things on today may change, it gets smarter, hopefully, and it grades things hopefully even better in the future. Well, you can build into your submission to the FDA kind of pre-thought out conditions, because FDA says that if something changes significantly enough, that may require a new submission, new product application, whatnot, in order to keep using that application, that device, that diagnostic. But in this case, they had built into their submission some kind of pre-thought out conditions where if it moved from A to B in its learning, that would still be considered safe and efficacious under that existing application. And so by doing so, they kind of, in a way, they're predicting what the future is going to look like, but you have to understand how your system's going to work, obviously. But in doing that prediction, they gave themselves more life before they had to go through that process of resubmitting another application to the FDA down the road. Now, probably it's inevitable with any machine learning technology that someday, unless it hits a finite point where it's no longer learning, but someday, if it continues to learn, you're probably going to have to resubmit at some point. But that is some of the challenges that come into play when you're working with technology like machine learning.
Yeah, and I had a very short stint in robotics where we developed a surgical robot for total knees. And I can tell you, just think about this as an engineer. When you're developing an instrument that's used in surgery, if it's a surgeon operated device, you have to only account for human error. So you're in your risk assessment and your failure modes analysis, well, it's training and an appropriate surgical technique guide is your mitigation steps. But if you're going to do artificial intelligence, robotics, where there is no chance for human error because you're allowing the machine to do the work, it is an immense amount of validation on coding. And you cannot have errors. So there's really the correction, the safety factor, the efficacy factor, it notches up significantly as soon as you take human error, which is kind of obvious of why we're doing the automation in the first place, but you take human error out of the equation, your validation requirements significantly skyrocket. So that's why I asked the question about digital. I'm just kind of lobbing up softballs to these guys, and I'm just going to step over to the side and let them talk because they're full of some good.
There's one other risk, I think, from a regulatory perspective, as potential designers to be aware of. Changing a line of code is really easy, right? And it may very well improve the product. I cannot tell you how many submissions were ready to be put to the FDA a week from one day, and some engineer coming and says, I changed a line of code. And then we have to turn back to him and say, we have to change 400 documents because you changed that line of code. We're not submitting in a week. So there's a real risk factor with the ease with which software is used and managed in this industry that it's worth bearing in mind. You don't change lines of code without a lot of talk.
Okay, so so now that we kind of have a flavor for what the regulatory pathway looks like, how do we recoup an investment in regulatory? So my question is how do we determine the regulatory pathway and then basically apply for reimbursement? So, and I think also let's provide clarity on what does reimbursement mean when it comes back to actually getting paid for that procedure. So take
That is the key question that you should always keep in the back of your mind as you're developing anything. It looks great, sounds great, works great. Who's going to pay for it? And mentioned before that we were in the FDA innovation pathway. Jeff Shuren, who is head of the device division of FDA at that point, took 10 of us people and our team to CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in Baltimore. And truly, you had 10 people from FDA, 10 people from CMS in the same room. You would have thought you would have had 10 people from South Africa and 10 people from the North Pole. They didn't speak the same language. They didn't use the same acronyms. They didn't understand each other. They distrusted each other. We walked out of there and Jeff Shuren said, oh my gosh, these are the two agencies. We are the two agencies most responsible for healthcare in the United States, and they don't communicate. So one thing that came out of that is there is now a parallel review path where CMS and FDA can review your clinical trial plan, because there have been occasions, and this comes back to financial planning, that FDA says, we only need 100 patients in your clinical trial. CMS, however, who's going to pay for this, would just say, that's not enough. We need 500 people in your trial. So it's better to get it aligned up front. know what FDA requires, know what CMS requires, get them agreeing on what that population size should be, how many locations should the trials be put in, and that way you can better budget and plan for what you're going to need to get approval by both to go to the market and to get reimbursed once you're in the market.
So to Steve's point, if you've heard me speak at the design engineering, or excuse me, the senior design course, sorry, when I've done the guest lecture on regulatory and reimbursement, who's at the center of that industry market ecosystem? Does anybody remember? It's the insurance company. And who's the largest insurer in the country? It's CMS. So they get to make the decisions of what's going to get reimbursed and what's not, and who's going to get reimbursement. And the other misnomer is the medical device manufacturer rarely, if ever, is the company or the entity that's actually receiving the reimbursed funds from CMS or the insurance companies. That's oftentimes going to the healthcare system, to the doctor. It's going to pay for that care for that patient, but it always has to be tied to an indication, an ICD-10 code or something along those lines. So just to clarify some of those kind of underlying fundamental pieces that are moving parts of the reimbursement system within the U.S. But to give you an example, again, real world, I try and bring it back to examples that you can, hold on to, look at, see that this really actually happened. So another company, it was a growth stage company. We were doing early stage detection of age-related macular degeneration. We had a diagnostic. They had a benchtop unit that was in ophthalmic and optometrist office, but we were developing a next generation head wearable that actually used AI for process automation to drive the test and take the clinician out of that system so that they could go off and do other more important things. But that instrument, we were trying to sell it for $40,000. That's a hefty price, but you think, oh, it probably was getting reimbursed tens of thousands of dollars every time it was used, right? No, it was reimbursed $62.44 on average across the country. $62.44. And that went to the doctor's office. So why would a doctor's office, an optometrist's office, for example, want to buy a $40,000 instrument when they're only going to get paid $62 each time they screen a patient with this test? So we had to actually go build out an economic model that they could input variables such as their demographic, in this case, age of their demographic patient population. And that model would then spit out how fast they could reach break even based on the number of patients they had, the ages, the splits of those patients across the different age groups. And because everybody that we were working to screen or that was intended to screen, because AMD is prevalent above 50 and it grows as you get older. So we were looking for, one, it helped us identify what clinics we wanted to target to sell to because we wanted to look at clinics with older age demographics. But it also made a convincing case that those with an aging population within their patient demographics were likely candidates and they could get a faster payback. And so that economic model helped to demonstrate that they could actually get payback within a year. And then it started to make sense. Okay, I'll invest in this $40,000 instrument. We'll get payback, break even within a year, and I'm going to start making money in year two. That's actually a good winning proposition for any technology that you're introducing into the marketplace. But it boiled down to a $62.44 reimbursement rate, which, at the end of the day, you're like, wow, how are we going to make this work as a company? And that's how we did. We had to convince people, though, but it took a little bit of financial demonstration along with the technology demonstration to convince folks of that.
Not a whole lot to add to either of those, except that reimbursement based upon a code that's submitted to an insurance company isn't the only reason why you might have a buyer. It may be that the readmission rate is less because of a product being used, that the risk to the patient in extended care is maybe shortened because a product is used. And those all are kinds of arguments that can contribute to the value of a product and why you might find a buyer.
Okay, so now we've covered the basics, right? So we've covered the basics on submissions. We've covered the basics on basically the breadth of the devices, covered the basics on reimbursement. And in reality, we can now serve 7% of the global population. We've just released a device in the US. So you have to essentially evaluate this strategy for every regulated market in the rest of the world. So you have to think about submissions, you have to think about classes, and you have to think about reimbursement. So that takes us into strategy. So where do you sit down and think about your regulatory strategy and your overall business strategy development, and how do you position it relative to investment or resources needed, and how do you execute on it?
You know, it begins very early, because if you have developed something new and innovative, obviously the first thing you want to do is protect it. You want to file for a patent. And I've seen so many companies come to us, we have filed for a US patent. Okay, where is your market? Well, it's all over the world. So then you have to begin to answer the question, in what countries are we going to file patents in? In the EU, which is a group, or we're going to file in India or China or wherever. Just remember, there is a significant cost as you add countries to the United States. One of your major investments up front will be to protect that invention around the world where it will be sold. That will be the first driver of where you spend money to look globally. The other is, you have to remember that while you may go to the FDA, over 50%, almost 60, 70% of clinical trials are now done outside of the United States, performed outside of the United States. And so again, a global perspective is required as you plan your testing. Not only after you file your patent, then you're going to go to testing, but then there's a whole business strategy of saying, okay, am I starting in the United States and then moving abroad? Because that drives who you raise money from and what the message is to them. They want to see market traction. They want to see that somebody's willing to pay money or can be reimbursed for this device. And by starting in the United States, that's maybe a great first step, but there could be a global market that is 10, 15 times bigger. So it is a strategic decision of where you start and where you're ultimately going to go. I would say 90% of the companies that we currently work with that come out of Clemson, USC, I mentioned that school, USC and MUSC, are focused on the United States simply because that's, they usually focus on the Southeast because it's nearby, proximity, lower cost. You're trying to keep your costs down. So you focus first on the immediate geography and then expand from there. But a global view is going to eventually have to kick in.
I can't agree more with the word early. There are several components to the strategy that you have to be thinking about. There's a regulatory strategy, there is the reimbursement strategy or the economic development strategy that you need for your product. There is a go-to-market strategy. It's funny, you know, people say, well, I've gotten through the FDA, we're all set. I said, your journey is barely begun. How are you going to sell this thing? So you need that go-to-market strategy early. And if you aren't exiting the FDA without a strong go-to-market strategy and buyers already waiting for you, then you're about ready to hit the valley of death. So there are lots of things that you have to be thinking about. And I think one of the things that always comes to my mind when I'm thinking about this particular kind of issue is don't do it alone. You need as much help around you as you could possibly get, helping you all the time. So friends, neighbors, experts, you know, I understand that he's willing to talk to anybody at any time. So you need to take advantage of all these resources that are truly at your disposal. And that's not just if you're starting a business, that is if you're trying to be a part of one. Because you have to understand everything about that business if you're going to contribute well to it and advance in a way that is in a growth pattern that you want and can enjoy as part of your career, professional career. So you think of it as a very complicated web. You pull a thread in the lower right-hand corner, and suddenly, for some odd reason, a thread in the upper left-hand corner moved. You sit around, why on earth did that happen? And go figure out why that occurred and understand all the threads that are interconnected as much as you can, so that you can see that the impact that you can have, even when you change a line of code, can be really dramatic.
The only thing I would add there is, yeah, strategy, keeping regulatory and potentially clinical needs front and center from the earliest days of the development of the technology. But it is so much easier today than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, to build a company around a technology and do it in a virtual manner. There are all kinds of contract organizations out there that can help you with just about every single facet and functional discipline to support that entity. You could contract with an engineering team. We did that at the age-related macular degeneration company. We had an engineering firm design, develop the technology for us. We ended up bringing the manufacturing in-house because we wanted to control it, because the original device that they had marketed, they had challenges working with a CMO, a contract manufacturing organization. Maybe that wasn't the right solution, though. Maybe we should have worked with a different CMO that was more mature, understood that marketplace, understood assembly of electromechanical devices a bit more than the one that we had originally. But there's CMOs out there. There are contract research organizations that can do the clinical trials for you. There are organizations like Russ's and mine that can help support regulatory, can do and build a quality management system for your organization. So all that said, it's just way easier these days to structure a company, minimize your internal headcount, minimize your internal costs, but you are going to pay perhaps a bit more for some of those services at times. But in some cases, it may be much more cost effective to go down that road, because you're not having to pay the overhead of your internal folks and those types of different additional costs that it takes when you're hiring up an army of people to move things forward. To give you an example, at the company, this was in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I was employee 35. I was brought in to head up the development of that AMD next generation device. We grew to 100. We were selling the existing device in the market. We were trying to get this device completed. We finished the engineering in about a year and a half, which was crazy, working with that engineering firm. We then had to stand up a manufacturing facility because that was the decision of the CEO at the time. We did so in 6 months. Again, this was unprecedented that we were able to do so. We didn't have our components, we didn't have parts, we didn't have raw materials. And we didn't have a team of people to actually do the assembly, and we didn't have a facility. So we had to find a facility. We had to start hiring. We had to start sourcing 28 different suppliers to get all those components in the door. And within 6 months, we were actually doing pilot production and moving that product forward. And we had the first finished device, and thankfully it was a Class 1 device, so it was easy to get through FDA. But we had that first device in the hands of our first customers 9 months later. It can be done. It's crazy. It's a fast and furious world when you're going down that startup or growth stage entrepreneurial pathway. But as I said last night to the folks that were here for dinner, being an entrepreneur is going to be the most challenging opportunity you could ever take on in your career, but it's also going to be the most exciting. And I thoroughly believe in that, and would encourage anybody to pursue that.
And I will second that, but sometimes the market totally surprises you. I'll give you a good example. During COVID, there's a company in Spartanburg called Global Transplant Solutions. They were a second-tier provider. They had 2 major competitors, and they provide the solutions that harvested organs are shipped in to a transplant center. During COVID, Cleveland Clinic, Mayo, everybody told them, we're not accepting any solutions unless they're hand delivered. Hand delivered, you can't ship them UPS, can't ship them FedEx. You have to get them off a truck that you send there and no one touches it before it gets there. They came to us and said, we need money for buying vans. We put an investment in the company. It allowed them to put a fleet of vans in. In this process, the FDA inspected their number 1 and number 2 competitors and found contamination and shut them down. All of a sudden, Global Transplant Solutions in Spartanburg, South Carolina, was the number 1 supplier of transplant solutions in the United States and now the world. But at that critical time, we were at the right place at the right time. And they say, you know, unless we'd gotten the money for those vans at the time when the FDA shut our competitors down, we would have still been way down here. But we took advantage of it. They capitalized on it. Unfortunately, we didn't get equity. It was a convertible note, and they paid the money back. So we got interest. Big deal. But there you go.
All right, so any questions now for our panel? We've covered quite a bit, so just lots going on, so bring it on. What questions do you have?
So with the FDA and everything like that, is it actually harder to try to go globally, like you said, Steve, or is it more like easier to kind of navigate FDA?
So I understand the question is which regulatory bodies are more difficult? And it used to be the FDA was the most, and they aren't now. It's the EU. They have something now called the Medical Device Regulation, and its demands are higher from a clinical perspective than what the FDA expects across many products, Class 2 products, Class 2A, 2AB products. So what we're seeing as a regulatory firm is a lot of companies in the EU trying to break into the U.S. market because the EU market's so tough. I'm not that familiar with other international markets. Canada Health is pretty stable. Australia is pretty stable. Japan, I don't have a lot of access to insight into.
I think probably the next in line as far as difficulty would be Japan, but much of their regulatory environment is also kind of based on the size of the population, in the sense of they want access to the best healthcare possible, just like everybody does, just like every patient in the US does. And so sometimes for those smaller markets like Canada, like Japan, like Australia, like New Zealand, some of those types of markets, like it's not to say they're cutting corners per se, but they may use other markets as a precedent. And it gives them confidence that if it's proven that safety and efficacy in the United States, it's not to say it definitely is going to get adopted and approved in those markets, but it gives it certainly a green flag, tied to that particular device. But again, every market goes through its own regulatory process. So I don't want to say that just because it got approved one place, it's automatically going to get approved in another.
I think also, the UK in its separation from the EU created a small complexity. Not a huge difference between what the UK does and what Europe does, but it still creates a complexity. The biggest problem for medical device companies that we see in the United States going to the EU is reimbursement. It's very regional reimbursement, and Spain's the worst. Every county or every state inside Spain has their own strategy, so you have to go through a real mess there. But reimbursement strategies are very difficult. And as a consequence, the right distributor and partner to have in Europe is difficult to find and choose. So, it's just a big challenge to find the right partner to have in the EU from that perspective.
And just remember that the future of healthcare, especially in the United States, but around the world, is going to come down to this: improved outcomes at a lower cost. That's what FDA is going to be looking for. That's what CMS is going to be looking for. That's what the EU is going to be looking for. Healthcare costs are high. And you've got to show improved outcomes at a lower cost.
So if I'm someone who's looking to go into quality or regulatory advising, what would be some things before I graduate that I can do to help procure a job even better?
Well, I could speak for my company, and that is have a great mind and a great attitude. Um, I'm not looking for anything more than that, except you're being an engineer and having a technical wherewithal to help us explain things technically to the FDA. So, you know, we have an incredible training program. We take people either out of Bachelor's of Science or master's programs, and they're, from a consulting perspective, it's all about billing hours. And our people are billable in the first month and fully billable between month 3 and 4. It doesn't mean you're negotiating difficult things with the FDA, but it means that you've got competencies and support around you to spend your day contributing to deliverables that we get to our clients.
The only other thing I would say is that Dr. Desjardins, Dr. McCurry, and Dr. Boyd have built a great program relative to the incorporation of regulatory and quality discipline in that function. And that's something that historically most engineering programs have never brought into a curriculum. And so the fact that they have done so, that is an important piece that most engineers coming out of school don't have any idea of what that looks like or entails. And so the fact that you're getting exposed to that now, you're ahead of the game. I just want to say that Clemson truly is ahead of the game by incorporating that, you know, front and center in their curriculum. I think that's a very important piece and a great step that they've done for many, many years now to incorporate that. So that's awesome.
Question about software and FDA approval. Let's say I write a program that takes 3,000 lines of code, but nothing's done in a vacuum. I bring in 3 different libraries for different functions. I run it on certain hardware. Does the FDA, are they looking at that primary piece I wrote, but also all the dependencies and libraries and the hardware?
So the FDA will want to understand your algorithm. They'll want to see it and be able to appreciate. Now, this gives all kinds of people heartaches because usually that's their secret sauce, that's their trade secret, that's their path. They don't want to share that. But nevertheless, the FDA said they've got to understand it. Now, with respect to what you're talking about, there's something relatively new called a software bill of materials, where you will identify all of the components that went into your software, including soup, software of unidentified pedigree. And you'll have to do a lot of work to demonstrate that however it was built, put together, that it is not going to create risks. And you've demonstrated that not only does it not create risk, but further that you've identified whatever residual risk may be left over and that you've mitigated that as well. So yeah, they are interested in those kinds of components, and they want to make sure that you've treated them in a way that satisfies their concerns about safety and efficacy.
I would just close in saying the FDA is very open to meeting with you. In fact, they're under mandate to meet with small companies and give them access. But the key word of advice I would give you is to listen, listen, and listen. Be advised that when they say words like, you know, one thing you may want to consider is this. You know what you're going to do? You're going to do that. They may not tell you directly, but they'll give you hints. And you have to listen carefully to the nuances of how they communicate with you because there's a deeper meaning behind it.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And that's why your company is important to your clients and my company is important to our clients, is because FDA speak is that, FDA speak. And it's not simply, we recommend that you do X. I mean, it's like your mom saying, I'd like you to clean up your room. She wasn't asking a question. She was telling you to get upstairs and clean up your room. And the FDA is doing something kind of similar when they talk that way. But they also have concerns, deep concerns, and they are committed to their mission. And I will also say that you should consider them your friend. Yeah, they can say no. Yes, they can increase your costs, but they are as desperate to see good products solve patient problems as you are. And so if you partner with them, you can have really good outcomes, and a better product and a better company.
All right. So I hope you guys gleaned something from that, because I think you just got a crash course, at least a semester's worth of regulatory. So let's thank the panel. It's a fantastic discussion. Okay, so that's our last panel for the day. So I want to bring up Dr. Hannon for 1 minute.
Yep, 1 minute. We just want to thank all of you for coming today, all the students, all of our speakers, faculty, staff, alumni, and it's been a great day. This, Manning, could have been, probably was, I think is, the very best symposium that we run.
You say that every time, John.
But it's been a great day, and there's been so much networking and so much positivity that's come out of it. And we're just grateful on behalf of President Clements, who couldn't be here today. But interestingly, he wrote to Manning. I mean, I'd asked President Clements several times, but Manning said, I'm going to ask him to, and he did. And he wrote yesterday a rather long email to Manning personally and said he's very sorry, he's got a lot of obligations today and couldn't be here. But on behalf of President Clements and Max Allen, I want to thank everybody for being here. As I mentioned before, we operate on faith and hard work and the Clemson family. So those are our 3 themes, and it's been really evident here today. Maggie, please stand up and give a wave.
Awesome, John.
Maggie to the rescue, for sure. And also, I just have to thank our whole team of interns who've been cycling through during the day. And Kimberly, we want to thank you so much for all that you did to make this happen. So for sure.
Great job, Kimberly.
All right, it's all yours.
All right, guys, to close this out, I just want to say, let's give a round of applause for all the panelists who did an amazing job. Thank you guys for flying in, coming in for where you come from. Amazing job. I just want to say, if you guys can give feedback, that helps us do these things better. So be critical. Please tell us whatever you want us to do. We will try to incorporate your feedback. We take it very serious. All right. Thank you, guys.